Jacob Steele crouched low, his back pressed against the rough rock wall, eyes scanning the distant landscape. The sun had set hours ago, and the alien world around him had plunged into darkness. But his enhanced vision could see in the dark, with perfect clarity. The wind howled through the jagged mountains, carrying the scent of sulfur and blood, two things Jacob had come to know well in his years as a mercenary. His fingers tightened around the grip of his pulse rifle as he waited for the signal. He had been on countless dangerous missions before, but none quite like this one. He'd been hired by the Asterians, a peaceful race of aliens, to retrieve their kidnapped children twins, barely 8 years old, Celia and Zarun. Their mother, Queen Ylira, was the leader of the Asterians, and she'd promised an extraordinary reward for the twins' safe return. But there was something about her offer that felt off. The reward was too great, too powerful. Jacob had learned long ago that when something seemed too good to be true, it often was. But money was money, and a job was a job. Still, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this mission than he'd been told. The twins had been taken by the Raxar, a savage, monstrous species that hunted the Asterians without mercy. The Raxar were not like any creatures Jacob had encountered before. They were fast, strong, and ruthless, with jagged claws and mouths full of razor-sharp teeth. They had no sense of mercy, no sense of honor, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence. These weren't wild animals. They were an organized, militaristic species with a deep hatred for the Asterians. The last report Jacob had received indicated that the Raxar were holding the twins in a vast underground lair, a labyrinth of tunnels and caves carved deep into the planet's surface, making it nearly impossible to find them without the right map. But Jacob had no map. All he had was his training, his wits, and a weapon at his side. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. He didn't move, didn't blink. The shadows of the rocky outcrops shifted in the wind. And then, there it was again, a hulking figure, large enough to block out the stars as it lumbered toward him. Jacob's heart rate sped up slightly, but his training kept him calm. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, waiting for the right moment. The creature came closer, its breathing heavy and wet, its massive silhouette growing larger by the second. Then, the figure stepped into the open, just 30 feet from Jacob's position. A Raxar. Jacob's eyes narrowed as he saw the creature for what it was, 7 feet tall, with dark, leathery skin stretched tight over its frame. Its eyes glowed a dull orange, and its long claws scraped against the ground as it moved, sniffing the air. It was alone, no companions, no backup. Jacob knew the Raxar were territorial, but this one seemed to be scouting the area, perhaps unaware of the human in its path. He waited, holding his breath, until the creature passed by. When it was just a few steps beyond him, Jacob slowly stepped out of his hiding spot. He moved like a shadow, silent and swift, his every movement calculated. In an instant, he was behind the Raxar, pressing the barrel of his rifle against its back. The creature let out a low growl, but it was too late. Jacob pulled the trigger. The pulse of energy shot through the Raxar's body, sending it crumpling to the ground in a heap of twitching limbs. Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, dragging the body into the shadows, out of sight. He knew there was no time to waste. The twins were still out there, and he had to reach them before the Raxar could mobilize their entire hive. With the first obstacle out of the way, Jacob began to make his way toward the heart of the Raxar's lair, moving carefully through the rocky terrain. The air was thick with the scent of the creatures, an oily, foul odor that made Jacob's stomach churn. But he pushed the discomfort aside. This was the job. This was what he had signed up for. Hours passed as Jacob navigated through the twisted tunnels, each turn more dangerous than the last. He was in the heart of the Raxar's territory now, and he knew the further he went, the more risk he would face. His tactical mind was always alert, always calculating. Every step, every breath, every movement was precise. He knew that if he made even one mistake, he wouldn't make it out alive. The Raxar were everywhere, their glowing eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Jacob wasn't afraid. He had seen death before, faced down enemies far worse than the Raxar. He had been in this kind of situation countless times. The difference now was that he was fighting for more than just money or reputation. The twins were in danger, and he couldn't afford to fail them. As Jacob approached the deepest part of the lair, he heard voices ahead. Low, guttural growls echoed off the walls. He paused, listening carefully. There were at least a dozen Raxar ahead, standing guard near a massive stone door. The twins were behind it. Jacob was sure of it. His heart raced. He knew he had to act fast. He could take them all down. He had the skills, the weapons, the training. But the Raxar weren't stupid. They would eventually realize he was there. And when that happened, they'd swarm him. Jacob's only chance was to remain unseen at least for a little longer. He made his way to a narrow crevice in the rock wall, just big enough for him to squeeze through. Jacob pressed his back against the cool stone, staying low and out of sight. Through the small opening, he could see the guards standing around the entrance to the chamber where the twins were held. They were tense, alert, but still unaware of his presence. Jacob took a deep breath, focusing. His pulse slowed, his senses sharpening as he mentally prepared for what was to come. He knew this would be the most difficult part of the mission. Getting the twins out wouldn't be easy, especially with so many enemies standing in his way. But Jacob Steele was a man who thrived under pressure, and he wasn't about to let a few monsters stop him from doing his job. He slid his rifle from its strap, ensuring it was set to its silent mode. With a quick glance at the guards, he made his move. The first Raxar didn't even have time to react. Jacob lunged, a blur of motion, and before the creature could turn, he drove a sharp knife into its throat. It gurgled, collapsing silently to the floor. The next guard was quicker, but Jacob was faster. He ducked low, rolling to the side as the Raxar swung its clawed arm at him. With a quick jab, Jacob pierced the creature's side, and it dropped like a stone. He was in. The twins were just beyond the stone door, their small, frightened faces peering through the bars of the cage. They looked up as Jacob approached, eyes wide with both fear and hope. He didn't have time to waste. With a quick motion, he unlocked the cage, lifting the door just enough for them to squeeze through. "We're leaving now," Jacob whispered, his voice low but firm. "Stay close." The twins nodded, and for the first time since he had found them, Jacob allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. But as he turned to make his escape, the ground beneath them trembled. The Raxar King had arrived. Jacob knew that the real fight was only just beginning. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the twins' hands tightly, pulling them away from the cage. The cold stone of the Raxar lair seemed to close in around them, the sound of distant growls growing louder with each passing second. The air felt thick with tension, as if the entire world was waiting for the inevitable confrontation. He could feel the ground shake slightly beneath his boots, and his instincts screamed that time was running out. The Raxar King, massive, terrifying, and cunning, was coming. Jacob had no illusions about what would happen if he didn't act quickly. He couldn't let the twins fall back into the hands of the monsters, not after everything he had already done to get them this far. He pulled the twins along through the dark corridors, their small hands trembling in his. "Stay close, and don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. The twins nodded silently, their wide eyes darting around as they followed him without question. They could sense the danger too, and Jacob could feel the weight of their fear pressing on his chest. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in all directions. Jacob's enhanced vision cut through the darkness, allowing him to navigate the maze of rock and stone with ease. But even with his training, every step felt heavier than the last. He knew the Raxar would be hunting them. He could already hear the sound of their footfalls echoing through the passages behind them. Jacob didn't dare to look back. Instead, he focused all his energy on getting the twins to safety. He had to keep moving, keep thinking, and keep them safe. As they rounded another corner, Jacob stopped, holding up a hand to signal for the twins to freeze. He listened intently, straining to hear the faintest sound above the rush of blood in his ears. In the distance, he heard something, a scraping noise, like claws against stone. It was getting closer. "Stay low," Jacob murmured, crouching beside a narrow crevice in the wall. The twins mimicked him, pressing themselves against the cold stone, their small bodies barely making a sound. Jacob's heart raced. There were at least 2 Raxar up ahead, their low, guttural voices drifting toward him. He could tell by the sound of their movements that they were on the hunt, searching for any sign of escape. He couldn't let them find him, not with the twins so close. The Raxar were relentless predators, but they weren't stupid. They would notice the bodies of their fallen comrades soon enough. Jacob needed to buy some time. He scanned the tunnel around them, looking for anything he could use. To his right, a pile of large, jagged rocks lay scattered across the floor. A few of them were loose, just waiting for the right nudge to send them tumbling. An idea sparked in his mind. Jacob nodded to himself. It was risky, but it might just give them the distraction they needed. Slowly, he reached for a nearby rock, positioning himself so that he could send it crashing into the tunnel behind them. The noise would draw the Raxar's attention, but it would also give them a few precious moments to slip past. He took a deep breath, his fingers tight around the rock. With one swift motion, he hurled it down the tunnel, the sharp crack of stone on stone ringing through the air. Immediately, the Raxar's voices grew louder. They were moving toward the sound. "Now," Jacob whispered to the twins, his voice calm despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. Without hesitation, he began to lead them down another passageway, moving as quietly as possible. Every step felt like an eternity, and the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The Raxar were close now, their footsteps pounding the ground as they rushed toward the source of the noise. Jacob could hear them growling to one another in their strange, guttural language, their voices filled with suspicion and anger. Jacob urged the twins forward, his hand tightening around their wrists. They were almost there, just a little further, and they would be out of the Raxar's territory. But as they rounded another corner, a terrifying roar shook the very walls of the lair. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The Raxar king. It was him. Jacob's stomach clenched as he heard the deep, rumbling growl echoing down the tunnel. The massive beast was near. It was only a matter of time before he would catch their scent, and once that happened, they would have no chance. Jacob pushed the twins forward, moving faster now, but the tunnels seemed to stretch on endlessly, each turn feeling more like a trap than an escape. His mind raced. What could he do? How could he defeat the king? The answer came quickly: he couldn't. Not alone. Jacob's thoughts flashed back to the moment when he'd first taken the job. Queen Ylira had made it clear that she would reward him handsomely, but there had been something in her voice that had made Jacob pause, something that hinted at a deeper, more dangerous game being played. He hadn't fully understood it at the time, but now it was clear. The twins were important, more important than anything he had first imagined. They weren't just 2 lost children. They were key to something much bigger. Something that Jacob wasn't sure he was ready to understand, but he couldn't let that stop him. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. They reached a dead end, a large cavern filled with twisted, jagged rocks that seemed to block any further passage. Jacob cursed under his breath. He had hoped for a hidden escape, a way out. But now it was clear that the Raxar had anticipated his every move. The roar of the Raxar king grew louder. He was closing in. Jacob could feel the vibrations in the air, the sheer weight of the beast's presence bearing down on them. He turned to the twins, looking into their wide, frightened eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You need to stay behind me. Don't move unless I tell you. Understand?" The twins nodded silently, their faces pale but determined. Jacob could see the trust in their eyes, the bond that had formed between them over the course of the mission. They knew what he had done for them. They knew he would do anything to protect them. But the truth was, Jacob wasn't sure he could protect them from the Raxar king. He heard the pounding of massive footsteps drawing closer. The beast was almost upon them. The shadows in the cavern seemed to stretch, as if the very walls were closing in. Jacob turned, his mind working at lightning speed. trying to figure out how to turn the tide in their favor. There was no way to escape without a fight, and Jacob Steele was no stranger to fighting. The moment the Roxar King entered the cavern, Jacob sprang into action. He grabbed the nearest rock, hurling it toward the beast's eyes. The Roxar King roared in fury, its massive claws swiping through the air as it charged toward him. But Jacob was ready. He ducked beneath the creature's massive arm, dodging the deadly claws by inches. With a swift move, he slid to the side, firing his pulse rifle at the beast's underbelly. The shot landed with a satisfying crack, but the king didn't falter. Jacob's heart raced. This wasn't going to be easy. He needed more than just his weapons. He needed a strategy. As the Roxar King roared again, Jacob's eyes fell on the twins. They were behind him, their faces filled with fear. But there was something else, something strange in their expressions. They weren't just afraid. They were focused, determined. Without thinking, Jacob shouted, "Get back!" He had no idea what they were about to do, but he knew he had to protect them. But then, something incredible happened. The twins stepped forward, their eyes glowing a soft blue. Jacob watched in awe as a strange energy surged from them, crackling through the air like a storm. The Roxar King halted mid-charge, its glowing eyes widening in confusion. The beast let out a guttural sound, half growl, half cry, as it staggered backward. It seemed disoriented. Jacob didn't know what the twins were doing, but he knew one thing for sure. They were not ordinary children. With a deep breath, he moved toward the king, determined to finish what he had started. The Roxar King staggered back, its massive body shaking as the strange energy from the twins crackled in the air. Jacob had no idea what was happening, but he didn't have time to ask questions. The king was still dangerous, still a threat, and the twins, they were still vulnerable. They needed to get out of this alive. Jacob took a deep breath, tightening his grip on the pulse rifle. The Roxar King let out a low, guttural growl. But it wasn't the same roar of fury that Jacob had expected. It was something else, something confused, almost uncertain. The beast's glowing orange eyes flickered as it tried to understand the source of the power that had temporarily thrown it off balance. The twins, still standing in front of Jacob, were trembling. But their eyes, those strange, glowing eyes, were locked onto the creature. Jacob knew they were somehow connected to this battle. But how? He couldn't say. Without warning, the Roxar King lunged forward, its massive claws swiping through the air with terrifying speed. Jacob reacted instantly, diving to the side, barely avoiding the deadly strike. The king's claws raked across the stone floor, sending sparks flying, but it quickly turned toward him again, its roar filled with frustration. The twins cried out, but Jacob didn't dare take his eyes off the beast. He had to keep the king's focus on him. The twins were still too young, too inexperienced to face such a creature. It was up to him to protect them. "Stay behind me," Jacob shouted, moving quickly to the side as the Roxar King followed, its eyes narrowing with deadly intent. He fired the pulse rifle at the king's side, but the shots barely seemed to faze the monster. It was like shooting at a wall. The king bellowed in anger, and Jacob knew he couldn't rely on firepower alone. He needed to outsmart it, to use the environment to his advantage. But the cavern around them was large, open, and filled with nothing but jagged rocks. There was nowhere to hide, no way to outmaneuver the king without taking a risk. As the king charged again, Jacob saw an opening. He dodged just in time to avoid another massive swipe, and as he slid beneath the creature, he grabbed a sharp rock from the ground. With all his strength, he thrust the rock into the king's underbelly, hoping to find a weak spot. The stone scraped against the creature's tough hide, drawing a deep, rumbling growl of pain. But it wasn't enough to stop it. The king roared again, slashing with its claws in a frenzy. Jacob scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, trying to get a moment's respite. He fired his rifle again, hitting the king's legs, but the creature seemed to barely notice the attacks now. It was enraged, desperate to destroy its enemy. And then, something changed. The twins, Celia and Zaroon, began to glow brighter. Their eyes shone with an intense, unearthly light, and a soft hum filled the air. Jacob froze, watching in awe as the twins stepped forward. They were still afraid, but there was something else in their movements. They were focused, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. "No, don't," Jacob shouted, knowing the danger they were in, but it was too late. The twins raised their hands in unison, and the energy that surrounded them suddenly exploded outward in a wave of force. The blast hit the Raxar King square in the chest, sending it stumbling backward. The ground shook violently as the king let out an ear-piercing screech, its body shuddering from the impact. It was like the twins had unleashed the power of a storm, a force that was far beyond what Jacob had ever witnessed. The Raxar King fell to its knees, its once confident stance now shaking with fear. It was as if it had never encountered anything like this before, anything that could challenge its strength. Jacob didn't know what kind of power the twins were tapping into, but he didn't care. He knew this was their chance. He moved quickly, taking advantage of the king's disorientation. He fired another round from his rifle, this time aiming for the creature's head. The shot connected, and the king let out a roar of agony. It fell to the ground with a massive thud, its enormous body crashing against the stone floor. The light in its eyes faded as it slumped. Lifeless, Jacob stood there, breathing heavily, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. The Raxar King was dead. The most dangerous creature Jacob had ever encountered had been brought down by two children who had, until moments ago, seemed like nothing more than frightened captives. He turned to the twins, his eyes wide with shock. What just happened?" he asked, his voice shaking. Celia and Zaroon were standing side by side, their glowing eyes still shining with an unnatural light. They looked at him, their faces expressionless, yet somehow peaceful. It was as if they knew exactly what they had done. "We are not like other children," Celia said softly, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "We were chosen. The power inside us is ancient." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Chosen? Ancient power? What was going on here? He had never imagined that the twins could be anything other than Asterian children. But what they had just done, what they had just unleashed, was beyond anything he had ever seen. Chosen for what? Jacob asked, his voice filled with confusion and awe. Zaroon looked at him, his eyes reflecting the same strange power. To protect our people. To stop the Raxar from destroying everything. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. The twins weren't just innocent victims, they were part of something much bigger. Something that had been set in motion long before Jacob had arrived on this planet. Before he could ask more questions, a tremor shook the ground beneath their feet. The entire cavern seemed to rumble, and Jacob felt the walls shift as if something was coming. Something powerful. "Move!" Jacob shouted, grabbing the twins by the hands and pulling them toward the exit. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew they had to get out of there. Fast. The tremors grew stronger as they ran, and Jacob could feel the heat of the ground beneath him. Something was coming after them. The Raxar King was dead, but there was still a presence here, something that was far more dangerous. Jacob didn't hesitate. He pushed the twins forward, using every ounce of his strength to keep them moving. The glow from their eyes illuminated the path ahead, guiding them through the twisting tunnels. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and a massive shape emerged from the depths, a creature larger than the Raxar King, something more terrifying, more ancient. It was like a nightmare made flesh, its massive form looming over them as it rose from the earth. Jacob's heart sank. They weren't out of danger yet. The creature let out a deafening roar, and the ground trembled beneath its immense power. The twins froze, their eyes wide with fear. Jacob spun around, pulling them into the nearest tunnel, but it was too late. The creature was already upon them. Jacob's pulse raced as he realized they had no choice but to fight. The creature towered over them, its massive form blocking out the faint light that flickered in the cavern. It was unlike anything Jacob had seen before. Its skin was dark and scaly, the texture of ancient stone, with veins of glowing energy pulsing through its body. Eyes like burning coals stared down at them, filled with an intelligence far older and darker than anything Jacob had ever encountered. Its claws were like jagged knives, and its roar sent a chill through the air. For a moment, Jacob froze, his mind racing. They were trapped. There was no escape. The creature's presence alone was enough to make the ground tremble, and the air around them seemed to pulse with raw power. The twins, still glowing with that strange energy, stood in front of him, their faces filled with determination. "Get behind me!" Jacob shouted, pulling them close. His hand instinctively went for his pulse rifle, but he knew the weapon would be useless against something like this. They needed more than firepower, they needed a strategy. And right now, his mind was blank. The creature snarled, its massive jaws parting to reveal rows of sharp teeth that could tear through stone. It took a step forward, and the ground cracked beneath its weight. "Jacob," Celia said softly, her voice steady, but there was a hint of fear in it that she couldn't hide. "We can help, but you have to trust us." Jacob glanced at the twins. They were still glowing, their eyes bright with an unnatural light. He wasn't sure what they were capable of, but after everything he had seen them do so far, he knew they weren't ordinary children. He nodded, his heart pounding. "Okay," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Do what you need to do, but stay close." 4. The twins stepped forward, their small hands raised toward the creature. The air around them seemed to hum with power, the energy radiating from them like a storm. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sensed the change in the air. It growled, its massive claws scraping against the stone floor as it took another step toward them. Suddenly, the twins' energy exploded outward in a brilliant flash. A wave of light and power surged from them, crashing into the creature. The ground shook violently, and for a moment, Jacob thought the world was going to collapse around them. The creature howled in pain, its massive form thrown back by the force of the blast. Jacob didn't waste a second. As the creature staggered, he sprinted toward it, using the moment of disorientation to his advantage. His rifle was still useless, but he had something else, a massive rock, sharp and jagged, lying on the ground nearby. He grabbed it, lifting it with all his strength. Without thinking, Jacob charged at the creature, swinging the rock at its head with all the force he could muster. The impact was enough to make the creature stagger, but it didn't fall. It growled again, its eyes blazing with fury, and it swung its massive claws at him. Jacob ducked, narrowly avoiding the deadly swipe. The claws grazed the side of his arm, and pain shot through his body. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The twins were counting on him. "Keep going!" he shouted, his voice hoarse as he stumbled backward. He needed to keep the creature focused on him. The twins couldn't fight it alone. The creature snarled, its enormous form twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It was fast, faster than anything that size should be, and it was closing in on him. Its claws gleamed with deadly intent, and Jacob knew he didn't have much time. Suddenly, the twins' voices rang out in unison. Their words in a language Jacob didn't recognize. But the power in their voices was unmistakable. The creature paused, its massive form twitching as if it were caught in a trance. Jacob couldn't believe his eyes. The twins were controlling the creature, somehow directing it, forcing it to stop. They were using their energy to keep it in place. But it wouldn't last forever. Jacob took a deep breath and made a decision. The only way to defeat this creature was to strike at its heart, literally. He glanced around quickly, searching for anything he could use. And then he saw it. An ancient-looking structure to the side of the cavern. Half buried beneath the rubble, it looked like a massive, jagged spear. If he could reach it, he might have a chance. Without hesitation, Jacob dashed toward the structure, dodging the creature's wild attacks. He could hear it behind him, its roars growing louder with each step. But he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The spear-like object was just ahead. Jacob could feel the ground vibrating with each step the creature took, but he didn't slow down. When he reached it, He grabbed the weapon with both hands, pulling it free from the debris. It was heavy, ancient-looking, but it would do. The creature was still distracted by the twins' power, but Jacob knew it wouldn't last much longer. He had to act now. He turned, facing the creature once more. The twins had done their part, but the creature was still dangerous. Jacob had no illusions about it. This would be the fight of his life. With the spear in hand, he ran toward the creature, his heart racing. The creature saw him coming and roared in fury, but Jacob was too fast. He leaped into the air, driving the spear deep into the creature's side. The impact was deafening, and for a moment, everything went silent. The creature froze, its massive body trembling as the spear lodged deep inside its chest. It let out a final, ear-piercing scream before collapsing to the ground with a thunderous crash. Jacob landed hard on the ground, his body aching, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet and turned to the twins. They were both panting, their glowing eyes dimming as the energy around them faded. The battle was over. Jacob stood there, breathing heavily, as the dust settled around them. The creature was dead. Its massive form sprawled across the cavern floor. The twins were safe, and the immediate danger was gone, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The twins weren't just children, they were something more, and whatever power they had unleashed in the cavern, it had been a force beyond anything he could have imagined. The twins looked up at him, their faces tired but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Celia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded, his chest still heaving with exertion. "We make a good team," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with pride. The twins smiled, but there was something else in their eyes, something that Jacob couldn't quite place. They had a purpose, a destiny, and Jacob had just become a part of it. As they made their way out of the cavern, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the twins were at the center of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. But for now, they had survived, and that was enough.